Hello, everybody. My name is Ben Tremaine, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about variable rate technology today in my presentation. It's going to be just kind of a high level overview of the various types. So I will talk about variable rate fertilizing, variable rate irrigation, and variable rate planting. Probably focus more on the fertilizing as well as the planting, just because I feel like that can relate to more people within the U.S. So I titled this slide "A New Way to Farm." Variable rate technology, or VRT for short, is kind of a part of this big word called precision agriculture. That's a very popular term these days. Technology kind of controls everything in the world, and it's also become more prevalent in agriculture as well. Guys are looking at data more closely, they're analyzing it, and they're seeing how they can better benefit their operation based upon that data. So with these various software systems, we're able to prescribe specific rates for different types of land features, let's say, so soil types, topography, as well as nutrient values, and we'll kind of get into that here in a second. So kind of where it all started, at least in my geography that I'm in, so I am an agronomist up here in Nebraska. There's a lot of center pivot irrigation where I'm at. That's pretty much the normal up here. So like around the 1980s or so, or even sooner than that, 1970s, when center pivots were first really becoming super popular, guys kind of figured out that they could up their planting populations underneath that pivot, and then they would lower it in the corners. And as you can see, I kind of put some arrows here to where the corners would be. So your pivot swings along here, and you might have like your end gun sprinkler that would water out to here or so. Um, and these would be all dry land corners, unless they would flood them, of course. But most guys didn't do that. So what they would do is they would plant, let's say they're planting east-west rows here. They would decrease their population, let's just say about 4,000 or so here, and then they would increase it, 4,000 within this pivot irrigation system, and then decrease it as well on this other easterly corner here. That's just because they could do that because they found out that, well, water was normally the most limiting factor for yield back then. I don't want to say back then, but most limiting factor for yield. And so now they had water and they could turn it on whenever they wanted. So they said, well, let's up the planting population, see if we can get more bushels per acre. And that is exactly what happened. So that was kind of all done manually. They'd get out, they'd adjust the planter. It wasn't as technological as it is today, but that's kind of where it started. So the advancements of VRT, anything that's applied on the farm can be applied in a variable rate application. So whether that's fertilizer, irrigation, water, planting, population, there's a various things, and that can be for any nutrient. If guys would like even lime a pasture field, they can variable rate that pasture field depending on pH differences, or if they have magnesium levels that are high. And they want to put some calcium out there, they can kind of base it off that magnesium level, and just it'll further kind of control their input costs there, and hopefully save them money in the long run. So digital agronomy is becoming more and more popular among farmers. In my role as an agronomist, I deal with technology all day. And I kind of look at this big data aspect. We're seeing how much data can you collect? Is that data going to be useful? And what can we use that data for to further help benefit the farmer? So diving into precision farming here, you got to establish management zones. So that requires grabbing some data, some way, shape, or form. They can be a map-based method, which I'll dive into a little later, as well as sensor-based. I kind of wanted to give some examples here. I don't want to say some one-off, but possibly some less popular items for sensor-based mapping. This VerSoil machine here in the top picture. So that has sensors on it, and you drive through your field essentially, and it'll tell you your pH, organic matter, any nutrient you need to. And you can do this, you can drive in a grid pattern. It gives you a very, very detailed map of different nutrients or whatever that you're wanting to look at. It's a little, it's a very expensive machine. Um, there's a few up in my area, as well as these smart firmers. I believe Precision Planting has the smart firmers here, and guys will run these on their planter. And it can kind of give on-the-fly information, as well as that information can be stored onto a computer database and later looked at for the following year, to determine if they need to adjust fertilizing rates or planting populations, etc., etc. So, kind of diving into the map-based method here, it can consist of many types of maps. I have a yield monitor screenshot up here. That's probably one of the most popular ones. Guys will make variable rate prescriptions based off their yield because usually where yield is lower, you can pretty much justify saying, well, let's plant a little less population there because that might be a low spot in the field, or oh, that's where we have less phosphorus values. So then they can be like, well, let's up the phosphorus a little bit in that particular area, and that kind of gets more in depth. We'll talk about that here in a little bit, but I just kind of wanted to give an idea of what I meant by a map-based method. And like I said, this is probably the most common versus the sensor-based method. I see this in more research trials than anything. But so sensors on a planter, for example, will go before the planter, and they'll send a reading back to the computer, and then that will automatically adjust the variable rate drives on a planter or a fertilizer buggy or even a sprayer. Let's say I've seen them on sprayers. Uh, it's expensive, and also, in my opinion, I would rather do the map-based method because you can analyze those maps a little bit more fine-tuned, let's say, than the sensor. But like a sensor-based method would be using these smart firmers here in the bottom right-hand corner. That's going to give you a reading, and you can automatically adjust on the fly, which is great, but you can also store those maps and then you can analyze them further. And I kind of like analyzing them further just because I feel like you can prescribe a much more accurate rating to that particular field versus kind of on the go. So this is just a quick demographic of the adoption rate of variable rate from 1998 to 2013. I could not find a more current, up-to-date one, but if I would have to take a wild guess, the adoption rate is or continuously climbing, excuse me, because I mean I know even the last 5 years or so, guys have really taken off because they do see a benefit in it, even though it is a little costly. So as you can see, kind of corn and beans follow the same trend, and then you're going to get into more, your specialized crops. Wheat's kind of steady. They a lot of wheat farmers that I know, they won't necessarily variable rate their planting, but variable rate some fertilizer, and as well as possibly variable rate like some nitrogen, springtime nitrogen applications. But I don't see that as popular as just regular corn and bean farmers. It's just more popular among them. So here's two more graphs here, just kind of demonstrating the percent of farms that are adopting to these precision planting, or not precision planting, precision agriculture techniques as compared to the percent of cropland acres. So the top graph there, the top left-hand graph is soybean farms, and the bottom one is corn. The soybean one is from 2012, the corn one is from 2010. So they're a little outdated, but it just kind of gives you an idea of what guys are doing. Um, it did not surprise me to see that the corn acres were a little more higher in terms of adapting versus the soybeans, just because of the fact that um, corn is king still. The beans are definitely becoming more analytical, just as well as corn acres. But guys want to see how much corn they can get, and for whatever reason, guys just absolutely love growing corn. At least in my demographic, that's their meat and potato crop to them. So, just kind of give you a little high level overview of the percent of adoption among the U.S. So another cool one that I thought was this chart here kind of shows the adaptation of variable rate based on farm size. So as you can tell, the bottom one there, over 3,800 acres, has a 40% adopt rate. This chart, I believe, is from 2013, and it doesn't surprise me because the guys that are big farmers have more capital, they have more equity they could turn over if need be in order to pay for these systems, because they are definitely not cheap. But in my opinion, the small guys can definitely benefit from variable rate technology just as much as the large guys. It just kind of gets a little scary there in the initial cost, but I'll talk about it a little later in this presentation. The benefits still do greatly greatly outweigh that initial cost investment based on the uniformity that you may have in your field. So let's jump right in here to variable rate fertilizer. This is probably the number one option for return on investment in regards to, there's a lot of guys that'll just put out a blanket application of, let's just NPK. They might throw some anhydrous out there. It's going to be the same level throughout the field. And then same with some phosphorus and potassium. They're just going to throw it out there in the field, be like, all right, I think that's what I've always done. It works good for me. And honestly, you're kind of wasting a lot of that if you're not doing some kind of variable rate application. Because, for example, this grid sample map here, shows you what you have, good areas and bad areas. And, you don't need to put the same amount of, let's just say, phosphorus on that lower right-hand corner that's got 1,290 parts per million compared to the one that's got 139. You don't need the same amount of rate out there. So it really does save some input costs. Kind of diving into it, so there's two different sample methods. The zone samples, which I would consider that bottom map zone sample there, so you can see the different zones. And in that pink zone, for example, you might take 2 or 3 samples. It's not as accurate as the grid sample above, but it just depends on how much input cost guys want to put in their soil sample and their soil fertility program. There's a lot that goes into it, but those are kind of the differentiating factors between zone samples and grid samples. I would like to always see a grid sample, and grid samples are real popular among guys. And I've seen anywhere from a 1 acre grid sample all the way up to a 10. I would say an average is probably a 2.5 acre to a 5 acre sample. So why variable rate fertilizer is good? Phosphorus and nitrogen are the most common pollutants in the water system. Phosphorus is becoming more of a realized issue just because of the runoff properties of it, just because it does not go into the soil very well. It's a very kind of insoluble nutrient. And let's just say, for example, so I know this map on the right-hand side is potassium, but let's just pretend that it was phosphorus for a second. And you can see the variability within that field, based on those grids. You have anywhere from 80 parts per million to 162. So, where you have 162 and you have 80 parts per million, you're not going to put an even amount on just because you don't need that extra potassium in that 162 part per million area. So you're only going to put 50 pounds down. You're just going to put down what the crop removal rate is. And in the low areas that you need a little more, you're going to increase that, and you're going to try to make that field as even as you possibly can. And throughout a time period, it'll eventually get back to where you can put a blanket application fertilizer down because you've worked hard at making sure that your soils are uniform now. And also, when you're working on that, your input costs aren't going to be necessarily as high because you're not just putting one rate down to the whole field. So it is very valuable in that aspect. Variable rate nitrogen is kind of a hot topic as well, but it's still kind of being explored. Nitrogen has a lot of leaching properties. It's very leachable, and that makes it kind of hard to prescribe an early season type nitrogen application because you don't necessarily know what you have out there unless you sample for it every spring. So that is a topic that I would like to explore more personally, but I just didn't want to dive that far into it on this. Potential cost savings of variable rate fertilizing. So, for example, you're going to put out some DAP in your field. Let's just say it's $400 per ton, 80 acre field, 100 pounds an acre. So that's about $1,600 for blanket spread through the field. Where if you would variable rate that, you could potentially save about 20% of your input costs, if not more, depending on how much you actually need it out there. It kind of goes back to this map here. You're not going to put the same amount in that area that you already have 162 parts per million because it's just not necessary. So, guys are really realizing this and taking it in consideration, and it's making their fields more uniform, to where they don't have a nutrient deficiency or an abundance of nutrients in one area versus the other. Variable rate planting. Farmers are always looking for an increase in yield no matter what you can do. Variable rate planting, I believe, can give that to them. there's management zones. It'll decrease your inputs on lower producing ground, increase it on more productive ground. Um, and then I also have some bullets in there that says, Nebraska variable rate planning has been around for multiple decades, and that kind of goes back to the slide I had in the beginning, a variable rate of this presentation, in regards to, guys didn't plant their pivot corners quite as heavy as they would uh, the field that was underneath the pivot. So, kind of jumping into that, here's a variable rate prescription for a field. Um, you can see the population ranges anywhere from 28,000 to 36,000. Let's just take into consideration the 28,000 for a second. All of those red areas are planted at 28,000. Let's just say that in that lower southeast corner there, maybe that's a different soil type. Maybe it's frequently ponded or a low area of the field. So you're not going to want to throw all 36,000 plants out there because that it's potentially just going to be a waste because it's not as good a ground, and you want the plants out there to be grown on the most productive ground, and you can utilize that highly producing ground to create an overall greater average yield in the field versus planting it all just one rate, just 36,000. And then in that same aspect, you're going to be wasting seeds if you do that. So that's just kind of that's an overall yield map there, or not yield map, excuse me, planting map just based on variable rate. So another thing to take into consideration, talk to your retailer about this, depending on your variety that you're planting or your seed rep, talk to them about it. All hybrids have an optimum seeding rate. So what I mean by that is, you can increase the population and yeah, you might get an increased yield, but is that increased yield going to trump, the cost of that additional seed? So you need to talk with your seed rep or your retailer about that to see what your optimal seeding rate is, and then base your variable rate prescription off of that. Because if you just increase your population, variable rate technically cannot be saving you any money because the fact that you're just going to be putting more seeds out there that's unnecessary. So just as an example, so let's say that for 1,000 seeds, it costs $3.50. So you have 100 acres. You're planning roughly increasing your population from 33 to 35,000. Will cost about $700. Now you may say, well, Ben, why? $700 really isn't that much, but you got to take into consideration that was only on 100 acres there. So if you're farming 3,000 acres, that $700 isn't going to be $700. It's going to be, 3, 4, 5, 6 grand that you're going to save on seed, just by kind of utilizing some of this technology. So just kind of keep that in mind. This is just an example of, an optimum seeding chart per variety. I don't have specific varieties on there, but talk to your seed rep or your retailer about that, and before you make any decisions on planting populations. Another thing, if you set a planter up for variable rate prescriptions, it's also going to have row shutoff units, so you can control each row unit, shut it off, and that's really going to utilize your land in the most efficient way possible, which will save seed as well as improve yield. There's guys that would just shut the planter off early. Well, then you'd have this big blank space in the field there, in the corner. Well, you're not growing anything there. It's just unprotected ground. So, you can use these shutoffs and you can plant all the way right up to your border rows there and utilize it to the best of the ability. So that's just a little side note there for variable rate as well that kind of goes along with it. Here is a technology return by farm size graph. This was a study done, I believe, in Iowa by Iowa State. They had 1,300 acres of corn with swath control and variable rate. So you can see even just seed saved by eliminating overlaps was 11.2 bags at $290 a bag. That's $3,248. So, you can kind of go through this, exactly seed saved by variable rate planting. They say they save 60 bags, $290 a bag. That's 17,000 right there. So, they're saving, their return is 81 grand. Now, I'm not going to say that's going to be that much for every farmer, but, that just kind of puts in perspective the amount that you can potentially save by using this technology. So let's jump right into variable rate irrigation. This is going to be kind of specific to certain geographies in the U.S. Up where I'm at, every field's got a pivot on it, so guys are already utilizing this But down in possibly like the Boot Heel in Missouri, let's just say there's a lot of furrow irrigation or flood irrigation, with polypipe. There are some pivots, but um, that's not going to be so specific as compared to this that I'm going to talk about today. Um, a normal pivot will apply the same amount of water throughout a field. So what you're going to do, you're going to use electrical conductivity of your soil. You're going to go out there and sample for that, and that Veris machine can do that I showed in the previous slide. Or you can have specific soil samples taken just for this reason. An EC value will give a good estimate of the amount of water holding capacity as well as your cation exchange capacity and soil texture. So you can get a good estimate based on that. Most samples will be shallow samples taken 0 to 12 inches, but you're also going to want to take a few deep samples, about 12 inches to 36 inches. So some more variable rate. A basic kind of variable rate prescription is kind of broken into what we call just like a pie slice. So that top graph there on the right is just a kind of basic variable rate prescription. And essentially all that's doing when it's changing from the green to the blue where you're putting more water down, it is going to slow your pivot down. So essentially your water pressure is staying the same. It's just going to slow the turning radius down on the pivot there and increase your water. Now there's new systems out today that you can actually break those down into specific zones, which would be that bottom graph there. So it's going to slow your pivot down, but then you also have the option of individual nozzle control and nozzle bank control. So you can control, let's say 25 nozzles at a time, and it'll shut off or increase pressure in those in that bank of nozzles in order to increase your water usage per sample. So that's a way more precise type of irrigation. So what does it take to perform variable rate irrigation? There's a lot of guys these days have electric wells. They've got GPS on their pivot already, just so they can control it from their phone. So if you want to do just the regular pie slice variable rate irrigation, that's practically all you would need, because you'd have to possibly get a new control unit to upload your variable rate irrigation program into. But most of them are pretty easy in the fact that they'll most likely already have that unit. They would just have to actually utilize that software feature. If you want to do the individual zones in the nozzle control, that's where it's going to get a little bit more added cost, because you're going to need nozzle controls. You're going to need an air compressor to control those nozzle controls, as well as they have nozzle valve bank controls, which is what I spoke of earlier. So you can control, let's say, just between one tower to another. You can just control that 25 nozzle spread as well. So really, a farmer must just calculate what he's going to get out of it, is what his rate of return is, and if it's going to be valuable for him. If a field's pretty uniform and it's leveled, a lot of guys have, leveled fields, you might not get much out of the variable rate. But if you have some hills and some valleys and some wet areas, you might get more out of this variable rate irrigation than those other guys would. So my involvement in variable rate, I'm an agronomist up here in Nebraska. I don't have any pictures of me actually writing a variable rate prescription, but I have this picture of me, so that's me on the right-hand corner there. Most of what I use is map-based data. So I'm looking at soil textures, I'm looking at individual nutrients from a soil grid map, like phosphorus or potassium. Also looking at yield maps. That's probably the most popular one. We just go off yield maps, as well as we have some satellite imagery that I can base my stuff off of based on foliar activity during the summertime. So the Veris machine and smart firmers, there is a few more showing up in my area, and we're kind of utilizing that and seeing what maps we can get based off those, which is pretty interesting. It's just hard to get all that data. It takes a lot of time to get all that data and to analyze it in order to write a prescription based off that. But that's a little bit about me, so I'm going to kind of keep going on what I do here. So this is a field, for example, in my area. You can see there's various soil types in it, like the number 3824 there, which is all the green. That's a silt loam. It's well drained, no problems with it. But then the 3952, it's a little wetter soil. It does kind of frequently pond. And if you can look at this map, The center part of that field there has got that 3952 soil number in it, and that's kind of a low area anyway, so that's more frequently wet than the other part of the field. So what I might do is look at that, and I might outline that and use some various other things such as a yield map or potential satellite imagery and kind of lower the population in that wet area, just because there's no sense of putting extra seed out there when we know that it's going to potentially drown out. Kind of looking at some yield maps here. So these are two fields for yield maps from last year. In the red areas, both for the top one and the bottom one. The top one there has a drainage ditch essentially that runs down that north and south, and so it's frequently wet. So I might look at that and be like, all right, let's outline that drainage ditch and decrease the population there. We'll increase it on the higher ground, the more productive ground. Same with that lower one. That red spot in the south corner, or the southern portion of that field, is a very wet area. Especially when the pivot gets turned on, it gets really, really wet. So, we might take that area and lower the population in that. So there's a lot of things that kind of go into it, and there's a lot of data that you could look at. I try to make it as simple as possible and kind of go from there. But here's one that we are currently doing this year. So this is a yield map from last year. As you can tell, there's a pretty big red spot there in the southern portion of the field there. That's a very low area in the field, and it's a different soil texture as well. So it stays wet for very long, as well as there's a little portion there in the right-hand corner of the I call it a pie slice, that is a little bit more wet than that other portion of the field, but it's not drastic. So we took this and kind of ran with it. And here's a prescription that we made. It's not a very intense one, but we lowered the population there in that bottom corner where the frequently ponding is. Lowered that down to 36,000. And then this gentleman, actually, he kind of got some new planter features this year and wanted to kind of test the capabilities of his planter. So we put that little circle there just to kind of see what it could do, make sure the row shutoff units were working correctly. And he just kind of wanted to test it out a little bit. So I'm kind of curious to see how that actually works when he starts planting this field and making sure it's working like he wanted it to. So increase that one to 43,000. Other than that, the majority of the field was set at 39.6, which is about an average population for this particular hybrid. And then we also kind of lowered it down up on that left-hand corner there to 37.5, just to kind of test a different seeding rate. This is something that kind of the grower wanted to do. So we discussed it with him, and we're hoping to see a difference in the yield map this year and hopefully a little bit more uniformity. So data supporting variable rate seeding. There's been various studies done. Like I said, it really depends on where you're at and the uniformity of your fields, what your nutrient values are. But there was some couple studies done here in Illinois. Northern Illinois study showed an $8.81 greater acre return compared to a flat rate 33.5 plant population. In Northern Illinois, you're not going to have that much variable soil types, at least from what I know of, as compared to Southern Illinois. You're going to have a lot of variability down there. So that's why you're going to see, in the Southern Illinois study, the rate of return was greater at 34.52 per acre compared to just a flat rate 27.3 plant population. So it's hard to get precise data for this because every year is different. There's been guys that, one year get a fantastic return, and the next year they're like, well, that really didn't do anything. So you just got to kind of take it year by year, as well as understand that it's going to be a kind of a long-term rate of return. Just like with anything else in farming, you can't base it off 1 year because 1 year to the next is completely different. So this next graph here is a study done by an equipment company up in southeast Minnesota. And I mean, you can just tell, you're like, holy cow, the profit gain is $116 an acre using variable rate. So it kind of breaks it down into the yield. He increased his yield pretty dramatically from 185 to 210. He's got drying cost in there. Some guys may not have drying costs, so it could be even a greater potential there for increased profit. And then the gross return per acre, you can see it's pretty significant. So that was just another example there of a study that was done. I'm going to go into some drawbacks here because there is drawbacks just to everything, everything's not perfect, and there's always if there's a pro, there's usually always a con to some people just based on farming practices or where you're at in the U.S., what's your weather conditions, and etc. Variable rate is expensive. I'm not going to lie. So to outfit a planter for variable rates, rather costly. If you want to outfit your sprayer or your fertilizer buggy, or depending on if you use pivot irrigation system, that it all costs money. You're not going to want to do this all at once. You're going to kind of want to kind of drag it out. So one year you might do the planter. Next year you might do the sprayer, or you could also have a custom applicator that has variable rate on his sprayer. You could have him spray your fields as well. So one other thing is going to be an increase in farm management and labor. It takes time to pull soil samples to see what you have out in your field. It takes time to analyze it. It takes time to build a prescription. You got to be fairly decent with computers, and it takes time to kind of comb through this data in order to make it more profitable for you. So you might have an outsourced company do that for you if you're a farmer and not good with computers. A lot of younger farmers are pretty hands-on with computers, and they're pretty good with them. So it's the older gentleman that might have that outsourced to a local expert. So one thing that kind of comes up a lot is, well, why would you invest all this money when the commodities are, they're just constantly tanking? It's pretty low commodities right now. It's similar to like what the 1980 commodity prices would have been. My response to that is, well, what better time to control your inputs? Because if you can control your inputs, then you're already off to a better start each year, compared to just putting, a blanket spread of fertilizer out there, or just running your seeding rate the same throughout the field. Because if you can bring those two down a little bit, you're already going to increase your potential profit margin at the end of the year. For example, let's just say, so you plant about 2,000 acres of corn. Just throw that out there. If you would just get a 5 bushel an acre increase for that at $3.50 per bushel, that's $35,000 right there that you could potentially gain from using this type of technology. So 35 grand over 2 years, that'll pay for the systems pretty dang quickly. So just keep that in mind. It's all about controlling inputs right now, and guys are more focused on input costs and what they're putting down, what they're putting in the ground, just because they want to shore up that profit margin for the end of the year. I threw this graph in here from it's a Central Illinois corn revenue and costs sheet. And I understand most farmers, it's not going to look like this, because some guys, won't have the cash rent. They might not have to dry their corn. They might have a dryer themselves, and it's cheaper to dry it. But it just kind of outlines a general overview of what guys are getting per acre in return. So, for example, in 2012, corn prices were good. They're getting about $341 an acre. Or now you look at the 2018 projected, 2019 projected. Guys are in the whole $12 if they're following this model. So, what better time to control that input, and make yourself money by conserving what you're putting out there. So in conclusion, as you guys can probably tell, I'm pretty pro variable rate. I understand that it's not going to be for everybody, because if guys have really good uniform soils, good management, you're not going to see as much profit gain from that as compared to the guys that have fields that are really ununiform, different soil textures, wet spots, low spots. That's where you're going to see the gain. So, make sure that it's going to work for you. I'm not saying just go out and, outfit your planter with a bunch of precision planting stuff to do variable rate, seeding. But if you can kind of work it out, do the math, and see where your potential return could be on it, it might be a good investment for you. So that's kind of something that each farmer needs to sit down and kind of calculate it out. But I do believe that there are a lot of areas where this technology could really help farmers increase their profit margin. So I would like to thank you for this presentation, and I hope that it was somewhat beneficial to you if you didn't know that much about variable rate. And if you have any questions, just feel free to comment. And here's my works cited. Thank you very much.